Neurosurgeons deal with horrific brain injuries, and these injuries can cause a lot of devastating injury to the brain and can cause long-term disability.
Football itself is followed by billions of people worldwide. Today we're going to see some pretty horrific injuries from football, and stay tuned to the end of the video where we're going to tell you the 5 most important things to do if you see someone that has had a bad head injury. This is Mohammed.
This is Adi.
This is the Neurosurgeons channel.
This is the only place where you find 2 neurosurgeons talking to you about everything about the brain and spine.
Roof, out comes the goal. It's actually Dembele's boot and catch.
Cristiano. Vamos a ver. Navigará y no acierta a despejar, viene desde atrás. Griezmann. Ahí.
Goldson. Looking for Roof, out comes the goalkeeper. Roof got there first.
The foot in the face,
and
wasn't
the
it?
boot was very high from Kemar Roof.
Yeah.
And down goes Andre Kolarz, the referee.
Add to that 2-goal advantage.
At least he's awake.
Yeah. There's another foot in the face, but it's just from down up.
Yeah. That's lovely. Looks very calm considering he just got kicked in the face. Just checking himself on the phone. Seeing if his modelling career is still intact.
Yeah. So these injuries are very bad because it's like the foot in the face. It can cause a lot of facial fractures, and these facial fractures might need reconstruction, which means if the bone moves in one way or another, it can cause pressure on the eye, can cause pressure on the brain if it's just on here, and it can cause disfigurement in the face. We don't get involved in these cases as such from a neurosurgical point of view, but it's our colleagues from maxillofacial surgeons who deal with the face, but it can also cause fractures of the mandible, and these sometimes needs to be fixed with small little screws and plates.
Also, sometimes when people get struck in the face, as odd as it sounds, they can get bruising or contusions. So contusion is a bruise on the surface of the brain, and often it's not where they've been injured, so you can get kicked in the face, and because the brain is contained within this box that is the skull and there's some space for it to move, it can get shifted backwards violently and bruise the back of the brain, and then it can shift back forward again and bruise the front of the brain, so you can get injuries slightly away from where actually the impact was.
Mm-hmm.
He's certainly going to need bandaging up. That's where it occurred.
His face is bleeding.
Yeah,
it's not clear where was he hit.
it shows you how much someone can bleed from their scalp when you get a head injury.
Oh.
So that was a knee, wasn't it? A knee against the head.
So that's again a type of injury to the head which can cause a fracture to the skull. Do you know how much the skull can tolerate in terms of pressure on the head?
I'd like to say it's more than 60 to 100 pounds, because that's the pressure that I put people's heads in when I clamp it for an operation. So a lot more than that.
A lot more than that. Yeah. It can go up to 500 kilogram of pressure on the brain, on the skull to get fractured. But in this injury, you probably need to factor, the speed of injury, and the other guy was just falling on him with all of his weight in this speed. So fortunately that he didn't get any more serious injury than this one.
Yeah, it's like Game of Thrones when the mountain squishes that guy's head. You've not seen it, have you?
No.
A lot of people will know what I'm talking about. Thankfully, that doesn't happen very often, if ever. I don't know. Oh, the landing was... Oh man, it's hard to watch that. That is so bad.
That's so bad, isn't it?
It gives you that feeling inside your body that you just... Oh,
it's like you're cracking, like a piece of wood or something. So the terrible thing about this injury is the amount of extension that he got to his neck. The neck's formed of the bone stacked above each other, the vertebrae, and that's supported by muscles and supported by ligaments. Even if you don't have injury to the bone, which means fracture of this bone, you can have injury or bruising to the muscles, or bruising or tear in the ligaments, which means that the support around the bone is not enough, and then that leads to what we call instability of the bone. And if that happens, that can also lead to injury to the nerves or the spinal cord, which can, in some cases, can cause paralysis to the whole body. So I would consider that as a terrible injury. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm just glad that at the end of the video he's up and walking about, although he's holding his neck, because it means that his spinal cord's not been injured, his arms and legs are still working. But I've personally seen an injury like that in martial arts, where someone got thrown and that type of force was put through their neck, and they could not move afterwards, completely paralyzed, and they ended up being one of our patients here. Thankfully they've made a good recovery, but that's why just watching that video, just you can see how much energy is going through something that shouldn't, or is not designed to take that much force, and it can be devastating.
A similar injury to this can happen to normal people while in the swimming pool. If someone is just jumping into the swimming pool, I have seen that before as well. You jump into the swimming pool, you underestimate the depth of the pool, and then you just go down head to the floor or to the ground of the swimming pool, and just your head gets on and cause that severe extension of the neck, and they become paralyzed. So be careful with this, and always make sensible movements when you are playing.
Knock him out.
And he's running very, very quickly, and just hit him with his kind of back or shoulder. Oh, that's his shoulder in his face.
Don't know if he meant to do that. It looked a bit dodgy, didn't it?
I think he's just lost orientation of the space around him, and he's kind of looking into the ball rather than being oriented of the other player. But yeah, again, these type of injuries, apart from the ones that we mentioned, it can cause concussion to the brain, which means that, as we mentioned earlier, it's just the brain is moving inside the head, and the patient can have feeling dizzy or even being unconscious for some time, and that's just because of the extreme force of hitting the head.
And sometimes if you do a scan on these type of patients who have concussion, the brain's okay, but they've done studies to show that the way the brain working isn't okay, and that's why there's been a lot of development in safety in sports to, you don't go back on the field after a concussion for a certain period because your brain is more vulnerable. The other thing you can get with that type of force going through your skull is you can fracture the skull, and then you can fracture some of the blood vessels underneath the skull. And people wake up and you think they're okay. They might, in the old days, carry on playing football or playing whatever sport they're involved in. But what's happening is there's a blood clot collecting underneath called an extradural hematoma, and it happens relatively quickly. And all of a sudden, 20 minutes later, they're unconscious. And if they are sent to us, we try our best to operate on them within 4 hours is what we try and do, because the speed at which someone can die from that is that quick. It's hours is all you get. You hit him from the back. Oh, he's unconscious, isn't he?
Yeah, I'm not sure if he lost his consciousness before or after, because he sounded like his head he didn't have control of his head while he was going on the ground.
That's one of the dangers if you get knocked out, especially in a sport. You're going to land on the floor and you don't have your basic mechanisms to stop you injuring your head. At the end of that one was people trying to go in his mouth and things, probably maybe having a seizure, they thought.
A lot of head injury patients can get seizures immediately after the injury, and what you can see, they're probably trying to open his mouth, because some of those patients, or especially the players, they can swallow their tongue can fall back and obstruct the airway, and there have been some incidents in the football history that some of the patients died in field because of that. So it's one of the things to watch out for in these injuries. Just the patient or the player airways is open and functioning normally.
So there's the 5 things we mentioned that you should do if you think someone's had a really bad injury. Mo's mentioned one of them. I think Mo would agree with me. Even if we were out on the street and saw a bad head injury, the first thing we would do would be to ask for help. There's only so much you can do outside of a hospital. So I'd say that's number 1. And then number 2 would be to make sure nothing's in the person's mouth if they're bleeding. If you know about the recovery position, then put them in the recovery position. It's a quick Google. We could put you a video link up here on how to put someone in the recovery position, and that's to make sure that their mouth and airway isn't obstructed. The third thing, as you've seen in a lot of these injuries, there's a lot of bleeding, and so you want to make sure that if there's anything bleeding that you can see, you need to put some pressure on it, because the scalp just doesn't stop bleeding. It's one of the things that people sometimes die from. I've seen someone nearly die from a scalp injury despite being in hospital. Next thing also that you want to make sure is that if they have any other injuries, to make sure that they're not bleeding from elsewhere. And one of the most important things is probably not to move them as well, because as you've seen, a lot of force can go through someone's head, and that's probably going to get transmitted through their neck, and so they could have an injury in the upper spine, the lower spine, and if you move them, then that injury could be worse. So after if you're comfortable with the recovery position, you put them in there, that's fine, but I wouldn't be moving them elsewhere. You stop everything around them. But number one, I'd always say, is call for help.
Yeah, that's true. So these are the 5 most important things that you need to do. Probably you might come across a dangerous situation like this in your life. So be sure that you know the 5 things, and let us know in the comments below which one of these injuries that you have seen today that you hated most, and stay tuned for our next video.